Good afternoon, everybody. Just giving a second here for folks to filter in from the waiting room. It looks like you are all here. So thank you for joining us again and welcome to the Thursday session of the 16th Vermont Organics Recycling Summit. This is an event organized by the Composting Association of Vermont in partnership with Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. And this year, it is being held in conjunction with International Compost Awareness Week. And so we're sharing the theme for this year, which is Recipe for Regeneration Compost. I'm Natasha Duarte, the director of the Composting Association of Vermont. Before we get going in today's program, I'd like to give a huge thank you to all of our sponsors who enable us to make this full week program available to everybody free of charge, which is great. I love finding any way I can to lower any potential barriers for participation. And our sponsors this year are Community Bank, Eco Products, Vegware, Addison County Solid Waste Management District, Vermont Natural Ag Products, AgriLab Technology, Compost Manufacturing Alliance, EcoPixel, Nature Cycle, the Vermont Produce Program of Vermont Agency of Agriculture, and Wasted, Separating Waste, Connecting Communities. So everybody give them a big round of thanks for helping us put this program on. Here we are today, May 5th. Happy Cinco de Mayo. And we are at the 1 o'clock session, the ins and outs of on-farm food residual composting. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite our first speaker, Stephanie Smith, with the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, to share her screen. And unmute if you're muted. And perfect. Beautiful.
I'm unmuted, so.
Excellent.
Can you see my presentation?
Yep, it looks great.
Oh, good. Excellent. I managed to do it. So my name is Stephanie Smith, and I'm with the Vermont Agency of Agriculture. I'm an assistant director of the Public Health and Agricultural Resource Management Division within the agency. And we within that division do actually a lot of things. We regulate plants and plant health and pests and nurseries and feed seed fertilizer and pesticides. Hemp is also within that division. So we do a lot. And actually, Emilie will talk a little bit more about what she does when she introduces herself. And I'm here to actually talk about on-farm food residual composting in terms of the agency and its work. So, and this is a new kind of delegation of authority or provision of authority to the Agency of Agriculture, where under Act 41, which was passed last year, and so we're in the process of kind of dialing in this new space for the agency, I guess, and for others that are participating. So my next slide. And I wanted to kind of start off like so the agency's role generally, I mean, we're regulatory. We are a regulatory body. Our authority is given to us by the legislature. And then we also go through rulemaking in order to guide how we regulate individuals. The agency also has a role in supporting the agricultural industry. And that is, specifically in relation to promoting products that are produced in the state of Vermont within our borders and outside of our state borders, as well as protecting agricultural crops through, for instance, invasive pest management is one of the ways we do that. And so we have a regulatory role, we have a supportive role, we have a promotion role, we have multiple roles, but most of this work that we do is given to us. We don't make it up, it's provided to us by the legislature. So I wanted to kind of start and talk about, the authority actually for this food residual piece is outlined in the Universal Recycling Law. And so we have the hierarchy that is a part of Vermont law. And we look at it and we see, we have to, as users of food and consumers of food, we should first start the first level there is we should waste less. And that's what we do as individuals. And if we're unable to do that, then there's this opportunity if the food is still consumable and palatable to the human, that the humans can eat it. And then if we get beyond that, the next layer down is, well, we can feed animals. So if it's not a palatable food product or a food processing residual, we can serve this to animals. And there might be some rules and regulations with respect to that. I mean, obviously, when we're feeding people, there are rules and regulations. And so when we're feeding animals, there's rules and regulations. And then finally, the last step in the hierarchy at the bottom there is being able to compost those food residuals. And this is an effort, obviously, to eliminate the disposal of organic materials, specifically food in this instance, in our landfills, which can, increase greenhouse gases that impact our environments. So why don't we take these byproducts or these, wastes and use them in a way that's actually beneficial rather than causing a negative impact. So when I go through this process, I wanted to mention that I want to kind of like break it down, like where are these regulatory authorities and what are we talking about when we're talking about food? And so the first place I go is I'm like, I look for a definition of food. And I went to the health department food and lodging program. And we all know what food is, but it specifically includes for human consumption. And so there are rules and regulations in the health department and at the FDA that govern how we manage food for human consumption. Next, we look at it in terms of what we do at the state, at the Agency of Agriculture. And within the Agency of Agriculture, as I mentioned earlier, we regulate milk and dairy processing. We regulate maple syrup. These are the foods that we at the agency regulate. The agency is responsible for, we've received delegation of authority to apply the Food Safety Modernization Act as it relates to produce safety. Who's sponsoring this conference today? And so we have individuals at the agency that do that. We regulate meat, poultry, eggs, and we regulate honey. So that's where we're in on the food. So how do we get to food residuals? What is a food residual? Like where is that? And so this is actually a definition in the Agency of Natural Resources Regulation. And it's source separated uncontaminated material derived from processing or discarding of food. So it's that food processing piece and that discard or that waste that we have. And we do it consistently with the Universal Recycling Law. That's what that section references. And then it specifically indicates that it's both pre-consumer and post-consumer food scraps. So it's not just what is discarded by an individual that hasn't been consumed yet, that has met sanitation requirements for the, set by the FDA, for instance. It also includes those food scraps that we've already gotten in on as humans and enjoyed, and we've now discarded that material, and then how we're going to manage that material. And when I wanted to mention, please put your questions in the chat. I think I failed to mention that at the start, and then when we'll take a pause after my presentation and before Emilie starts, and we'll answer a couple of those questions if we have time in between. So next, so the management of those food residuals. This is actually a breakdown of the law that's referenced in this previous slide, the Universal Recycling Law. So 10 VSA 6005K. And so this is from that law. So it talks about like separating the food residuals from other solid waste. It allows for a little bit of food residuals to then make it into the solid waste stream, for instance. But it's, that the person who is discarding of that waste has to have a program in place in which to address the separation of these materials, and then also arrange for the transfer of those materials to a location that either manages those food residuals or then they're managed on site. Food processing residuals. So food processing residuals is included within the definition of food residual. I want to say that first. How I'm going to refer, I'm going to refer to these terms separately, food residual and food processing residual. So I wanted to mention that up front, despite the processing residual being nested within the food residual definition. So I just wanted to provide a clarification there for folks for how I'm going to present the information, because it's a little bit of a distinction between the two. what is a food processing residual? These are examples: ice cream whey, fish cannery waste, brewery and distiller grains, beet pulp. So like the actual ends and bits of vegetables that are not palatable or desirable for human consumption, or even, as I mentioned, like whey. Like not everybody wants to have whey as a part of their human consumption. And so this can be considered a food processing residual. And this is one of the pieces that can move through this hierarchy and otherwise be composted. A food residual, it includes both pre and post consumer food residuals. So pre-consumer could include grocery store produce, bakery waste, expired products, or foods that are just not being consumed, or generally, again, are not palatable. And then it includes that post-consumer food residual. So this is the plate waste. And I understand this is a statistic that I received. I don't know if it's entirely accurate, but I did find it, that we as Americans generate approximately 100 pounds of post-consumer food waste per person per year. This is actually a photo of my food waste, and there's a bouquet of flowers in there. I needed some photographs, and so I went out and looked at my food waste. And this has already been entered into the system of our natural process here at our house. So that's the food side. Like that's what we're looking at on the food side. And then Natasha asked me to go into a little bit about feed for animals and how all that works. So again, I'm going to come back and I'm going to return to the agency. We regulate per the regulations that are provided to us by the legislature. And so in addition, so we have regulations at the agency for how we feed animals and what we feed animals, for the purposes of the health of those animals, for the purposes of if they're used in an agricultural, a food cycle, they become food for humans, to ensure the health of the humans that consume those animals. So what are we talking about here? So I mentioned before that when food is made for human consumption, there are rules and regulations that apply to it to ensure the sanitary and safety and health for the consumption of that food. Same deal for animals. And so there are, again, we have in the state of Vermont, we have the Vermont commercial feed rule. And we also have other laws, but, and I'll mention those in a little bit, but you may be prohibited from incorporating some of these food residuals as a feed in the food system in Vermont. So there's a potential prohibition, and then secondly, there's potentially a requirement to meet certain sanitation requirements for that feed for animals to be registered in the state of Vermont and to be distributed. So here we're going to back up a little bit. The federal laws that govern feed for animals there's the Federal Swine Health Protection Act. I am not an expert on these. I just know they exist. There's the BSC rule, which also protects the health of animals and humans. And then there's the Food Safety Modernization Act that I mentioned relative to protecting the health of humans, relative to produce safety rule as an example, but there's also provisions of that act that apply to feed for animals. As I mentioned already, there's the commercial feed law in the state of Vermont, and then we also have a Vermont law that prohibits the feeding food waste, so post-consumer food waste to swine. There are many states that have a law like that as well. We're not alone in that. So what does the commercial feed rule do? It manages the things that are fed, or the items that are fed to animals, to ensure that they're nutritious, that there's a label guarantee for the nutritional value that it provides to the animal, that it's uniform throughout the product. It's not like, a pocket of fat here and not there. And that it's consistent from batch to batch based on the process that it goes through and how it's marketed and branded. It includes precautionary statements. It includes how you're supposed to feed the animal that you're feeding, as well as protections or the ability actually for the agency to regulate adulteration of those products. So pre-consumer food residuals and food processing residuals that are commonly registered generally include high fat and high protein. You know, they can serve as an animal feed. They have a nutritional value. There could be depackaged bakery waste. It could be spent brewer's grains. Whey and eggs or processed dairy and eggs are not prohibited food waste for livestock. So those are things that can enter the commercial feed system. While grocery store produce can be a pre-consumer food residual that is provided to livestock, it generally doesn't have a high nutritional value. So folks don't go through the process, and it's not consistent. It doesn't go through the commercial feed registration process. However, the Agency of Agriculture, because that food has already gone through, for instance, because I'm talking about produce, has already gone through the FSMA generally for grocery stores produce rule. It has already been through a process to be deemed to be sanitary, and therefore it doesn't have to be registered as a food by the agency as a feed for animals. And I understand this is kind of confusing, but I'm giving it my best. For post-consumer food residuals, which we're talking about, which is plate waste, that requires further processing. It is not gone through a sanitation or a process that ensures that it's sanitary for consumption by animals. And so most of that post-consumer food residual, in order for it to be considered a commercial feed, does have to go through additional processing. So how does this all come back to farming? And Act 41 specifically, that was kind of, I was setting the table, and now I'm hoping to bring it home a little bit. So the agency regulates agricultural practices in farming, and under Act 41, the definition of farming was expanded to include some additional activities that include the importation of a certain amount of food residuals, which would include food processing residuals, onto a farm, and it would be considered a farming activity. The required agricultural practices, both the definition in Act 250, which is the statewide land use law, and in the required agricultural practices, there was this new addition of what is farming. And what do the RAPs, in addition to including this new version or this new farming activity, it also allows for the importation of 1,000 cubic yards of just food processing residuals. So the new definition of farming has expanded upon that. And then the RAPs also encourage management practices to build soil health. So what we're seeing is that Act 41 is supportive of the required agricultural practices, and this new regulatory requirement by the agency is also supportive of the required agricultural practices. So they're kind of layering on top of each other, where we start with the required agricultural practices where farming is defined, and then the rules that we're still drafting that are coming into place are supportive of those RAPs. So this is the new definition of farming that is now found in the required agricultural practices and as well in Act 250. And so this is the expansion. A farm can import up to 2,000 cubic yards per year or less of food residuals or food processing residuals. The definition of farm, and I'm breaking this down because we have, like, you know, the new policy is one thing, but then we have all the words contained within the policy that are otherwise defined elsewhere, either in the RAPs or they might be defined in Vermont law. And so we have to consider all pieces of it in order to understand what the agency is allowed to regulate and what people are allowed to do. And so the definition of a farm in the RAPs is a parcel or parcels of land owned, leased, or managed by a person primarily devoted to farming. And so then we refer back to that that inclusion of that new what you can do, which is farming, which so I'm talking, this is kind of like internally reflexive, but it's that 2,000 cubic yard ability to import that material. And then it's then further broken down, for the production of compost specifically. I forgot that part. So it's the importation of 2,000 cubic yards of food residuals or food processing residuals onto a farm for the purposes of the production of compost. And then compost is also defined in the RAPs. And so that's what we're looking at. The ability to do, and is now included in farming. Additionally, if you're going to engage in this, the compost has to either be principally used on the farm where it is produced, and we have a definition of what principally used is, which is that more than 50% of either by volume or weight of the compost produced on that farm is physically and permanently incorporated into the native soils on the farm as a soil enhancement, and is not removed or sold at any time thereafter. And so if you're going to import those 2,000 cubic yards of food residuals or food processing residuals, at least 50%, more than 50%, excuse me, has to be, when you produce that compost has to be used on the site of the farm and incorporated into the soils. Let's see here. Then there's the provision that if you can also do this activity if the compost is produced on a small farm that raises and manages poultry. So so you can either use more than 50% of the compost you produce on your farm, or you can be a small farm that manages poultry in order to engage in this activity. And small farm is defined in Vermont law, and currently, as defined in Vermont law, this is not in the RAPs. It is, well, actually, it kind of is in the RAPs, but then it refers to state statute. A small farm means a parcel or parcels of land on which 10 or more of the acres are used for farming, that house no more than the number of animals that constitute a medium farm operation, and house at least the number of mature animals that the agency, the secretary of the agency designates by rule under the required agricultural practices. And currently those numbers, based on Vermont law and the required agricultural practices, that those poultry numbers are 4,000, over 4,000 turkeys, over 2,000 laying hens and broilers with a liquid manure management system, and then over 6,000 laying hens or broilers without a liquid manure management system. Or that are used, those 10 acres are used for production of crops. So that's currently how small farm is defined. Now, there is a bill that's moving, or it's in Senate Finance right now, that discusses changing that definition of small farm in this way. The bill number is House Bill 709, which would then just reduce those farm numbers, those animal numbers, excuse me, to the numbers listed in the RAP, specifically under section, not 3.2, I guess it is under, I don't have the number section, but it's just the minimum of mature animal numbers outlined. I think it is 3.2 in the RAPs. And so those minimum animal numbers are 50 turkeys or geese, 100 laying hens, 250 broilers, or 100 ducks. And then the minimum acreage is 4 acres. And so these are the requirements in order to be involved in the on-farm residual composting operations. You need to meet this requirement if you intend to sell the compost that you make off your farm and exceeding that other 50% requirement. So the agency is going through a rulemaking process. We haven't posted our rules as of yet with the Secretary of State's office. We haven't, been before the interagency committee on legislative rulemaking. We have engaged with some stakeholders with respect to the rule, but these rules, I believe, will live outside the required agricultural practices rule, and they however, they are supportive of it. And the goal being that we would allow, that we want to allow on-farm composting and the recycling of food waste in a responsible manner. And that ensures, consumer protection, public health, environmental protection, so on and so forth. Currently, as drafted, it incorporates a registration requirement that's not dissimilar to the current RAPs for some small farm operations. It also, again, as I mentioned, consumer and environmental protection standards that include siting and design, as well as testing requirements of compost, finished compost. Requires some training of individuals that are participating in this process, and this is not dissimilar to the ANR's rules. We also would have record keeping, decommissioning plans for individuals that decided that they, after having built up a composting program, that they would be able to decommission the site in a responsible manner, as well as a listing of those activities that would be prohibited by an individual that's engaging in these in the on-farm food residual composting activities. Also, part of the rules we're going to suggest that there be an attestation by those that become involved in the program to understand that the requirements of the rules addressing siting and design and management of food residuals, that they understand the requirements of the rule, that they will work with generators to ensure that the food residuals that are imported to their farm are free of contaminants, both physical and chemical. They know the risk and responsibility of importing food residuals and food processing residuals that may contain contaminants, and understand that they have to dispose of any of these contaminants and pay whatever fees are associated with that disposal, responsible disposal. And then as well that food residuals and food processing residuals aren't necessarily an animal feed unless they're registered as such under the Vermont commercial animal feed rule. So additionally, also under Act 41, the agency was given the ability to register soil amendments. And this is to address where the compost goes. So compost squarely falls under the definition of, falls within the definition of a soil amendment. The registration requirements, here's an example label. You have to include ingredients within your label that list in a decreasing, either by weight or volume, the decreasing ingredients of that particular product that you've made. You have to include contact information. There should be a purpose statement, and then obviously the weight of whatever you're selling, like a quantity amount of that particular soil amendment. This requirement to register applies to any kind of compost that's distributed, and distributed has a very specific definition in Vermont law. This is found in Vermont law. It means to import, consign, manufacture, produce, compound, mix, blend, fertilizer, or a soil amendment that is offered for sale or to sell, to barter, or otherwise supply to another individual. So it's pretty expansive. And that I think if individuals are doing on-farm food residual composting and they are selling that compost off the farm, they will need to provide a label. If it's in bulk, it doesn't need to, obviously, you can still put a yard in the back of a truck, but you need to have a label for whatever you're providing to the individuals that are purchasing your products. There's a definition of soil amendment. And there's a bunch of things that the agency registers. We register fertilizers, we register lime, and then this is an additional product that we register at the Agency of Agriculture. And so, but compost is squarely within, falling in with what a soil amendment is. There is a bit of a carve out for compost product from a facility that is under the jurisdiction of the Agency of Natural Resources, unless it's marketed and distributed for the use in the production of an agricultural commodity. That, if it is, then it would have to be registered by the agency. And that is my presentation. And I believe we have questions, and I'd be willing to take a couple at this point in time.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Yeah, a couple questions came in, and I have a couple questions, but let's see. I'm first going to invite John, if you'd like to unmute and ask, you're welcome to.
Sure. Thanks for your presentation, Stephanie. I'm from EPA. So we work on compost as one of our key initiatives on the food waste team. And I had two questions. One is, when you're going through those feeding animal laws, like at a state level, and you said you're not alone in that, I'm wondering, like, for example, if you're in a specific state, do laws or rules according to how you feed animals differ by county, or does the entire state pretty much set that standard for what can and can't be fed to animals, and like that's basically what you abide by?
So I can't speak for other states. I do not know how other states treat, I don't know, California is vast, so I can't speak for other states, but I can say in the state of Vermont, it is statewide. The applicability of regulation is statewide. So I can provide that information. I can't speak for others.
Okay. And have you found the sort of process of pushing all of this through the legislature is going quickly? Is it going slowly? Is it going at somewhat of an okay pace? I'm wondering kind of how all of this is working.
So when you say, so the legislature, we follow what the legislature and the governor signs into law. So that happens on the front end, at least for the rulemaking side. There was a deadline that the agency would begin the rulemaking process by January of 2022. We have not begun the formal rulemaking process, but we have begun the drafting process. We currently have a draft in front of our general counsel, and he's poking holes where he sees fit to help us dial it in. And then we also have shared with some stakeholders that have been actively and engaged with the agency prior to this point in time that we are aware of. So the rulemaking process is going slower than is anticipated by the legislature, but it is also going, so it is moving. However, we know we haven't begun it yet, like the formal process yet. So I hope I answered your question.
You did. Thank you.
Good. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Thank you, John and Stephanie. And so Toby asks, if post-consumer food was processed according to food safety practices, school lunch, for example, do those plate scrapings need to be further processed? And is it a question of storage after serving?
They would likely need to be further processed in order to be registered with the commercial feed law in the state of Vermont. If anything, to ensure that they're uniform for it to be considered a registered feed in Vermont. Now, this doesn't prevent the ability for a farmer to allow their poultry livestock from foraging on plate waste that has been imported to their farm. That's not a prohibition. It's not considered a feed, quote unquote. It's not being guaranteed with any nutritional value. It doesn't, if it's poultry, it does not violate the BSE rule. So that's how it's being treated at the agency level. But if it were to be registered as a commercial feed, it would more than likely need to go through further processing because there's pathogens introduced by the virtue of us eating the food. Like it's beyond, it's going back. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? I don't, I'm not.
That's the answer, Stephanie. Thank you. Yeah, it's not that my pig can eat what my child ate, it can't eat what my child ate at lunch. It's what all the other children eating the lunch contribute to that food scrap.
Yeah, and yeah. I want to be clear, yes, Toby, and I want to be clear that a farmer or an individual that's raising livestock for their own personal consumption the ability to feed plate waste to that animal for personal consumption, so long as it doesn't make it to the consumer market, there are no regulations regarding that. Individuals can make their own decisions.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah. And that I want to just draw on that a little bit, because Stephanie and I have also talked about the difference between animal feed in capitals, right, versus feeding animals. And so there are different regulatory things that are brought into play when you talk about something as an animal feed. And so I've learned to start being, to checking myself and being really clear. What am I talking about? Are we talking about, laying hens foraging? Are we talking about feeding animals versus calling something an animal feed? So just to share that. Another question that we got is, when you were talking, Stephanie, about the small farms, you had first said more than 10 acres, and then with H709, that might be reduced to 4 acres. But the question is, what if the farming takes place on less acreage than that? And before you answer that, I'm going to tack on another question, because I've received this actually 3 times in the past month. So I knew this session was coming up, so I held on to this question. What if a parcel is bigger, but the productive part, like the farming part, like maybe you have 15 acres, but half an acre is in production? So is it the strict parcel size, or is it just what is being the piece that's being utilized for a farming activity? And then the initial question was, and what if it's just smaller than 4 acres? What if you have 2 acres in your farming?
Yeah, so I don't want to be specific. I don't want to tell folks that have 2 acres and are farming with 100 laying hens, I think that was the number that I provided earlier, that they may or may not be able to engage in this activity. I feel like I want to have, if there was a specific question and the agency was entertaining it and applying rules that were established, I would want to have all the facts at that point in time in order to provide a sufficient answer. Sure. And I don't feel that, I know it seems like we're providing enough information, but I'm fearful of telling somebody no when I actually might not have all the information. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to encourage people to inquire. When we have our rules in place, we'll do the appropriate analysis. I also need to consult with we have individuals at the agency that administer the required agricultural practices, mm-hmm. and that's not me. So I want to give them an opportunity to weigh in as well. But still, yeah. I'm not saying we're foreclosing the opportunity. I just think we need to have further conversation.
Okay. And that holds for both smaller than 4 or less than 4 or 10 acres, as well as if it's just a small portion in a larger parcel that's being
in a larger
used.
Parcel context. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
I suspect there are decisions that have been made under the RAPs that address some of these mm-hmm. issues that are unrelated to composting. And we might have a body of decisions that I'm unaware of. So I don't feel comfortable weighing in.
Yeah, no, fair enough, Stephanie. Carolyn, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie, for your awesome presentation. One aspect that stood out to me, where I wanted just to clarify and maybe double check with you on, is indeed the definition of small farm, which is really fun to trace back in the law and try to find out what does that actually mean in terms of animal numbers. So how rural Vermont has been interpreting that. So the Act 41 basically allows small farms that raise or manage poultry to commercially sell all their compost, and not just and not also have to principally use so the majority of on the farm. And that term small farm is then defined in the RAPs as referencing Title VI Vermont Statute, Section 4871. So you go then into mm-hmm. Title VI. And then when you're in Title VI, Section 4871, you see that is then again referencing to another section. It says that house no more than the number of animals specified under Section 4857. So then you go into the next section, and then you find finally that small farm, here we go, is a animal feeding operation which houses no more, not at minimum, but no more then and in terms of laying hens, it's 24,999. And so we've been interpreting, because you also want to be a farm at all, if it's no more, so what is the minimum? And that is, I think, defined again in the RAPs as at least 100 laying hens. So somewhere in that spectrum between 100 and not more than roughly 25,000 laying hens, that's the tier of poultry farms that can be commercially selling all the on-farm composted food residuals.
So I understand where you are. 24,000 was the number. So that's the medium farm operation. And so there's another, if you go to section 4.1 of the RAPs, that sets the small farm floor.
Well, that's the certified small farm.
Yeah, but ultimately, I wanted to make the point that, and we can have this conversation, and I'd be happy to share this information with the attendees to this conference to ensure that we're providing the right interpretation. But I think that the not more than is referencing if you have more than your medium farm operation, and then it goes to the small farm operation. I don't think it skips over that middle entire certified small farm piece. That's my interpretation of it, but we have the bill, the miscellaneous ag bill that is in Senate Finance, because we understand that's why the change is happening, is to clarify this particular issue. It may address other issues as well, but to allow for that lower number rather than that other number, but certainly not the medium farm operation number.
Right. Just before I pass on, what's in legislation is not a new. It's just a clarification. It's not changing substantially anything. It's just clarifying that below the certified small farm, there's already a legal tier that's the small farm. And that's just making this whole dance I was just walking you guys through a little bit easier by referencing that more clearly. But it's not changing substantially anything. I was also just quick, my question would be, are there farmers in the room who are interested in getting into diversifying into this? Thank you. Yes,
I actually had that in my presentation that I meant to ask before I started, if it was possible to see folks raising hands. I see Michelle Jackson has raised their hand. Anybody else?
So today, it looks like maybe just one. And so I do see that Toby asked another question if time allows. And Michelle, just to be clear, are you raising your hand in response to identify yourself as a farmer? Did you have a question? I don't want to skip you, but I also do want to make sure that we give Emilie, our next presenter, time to go through her stuff.
I am a farmer.
Okay.
So yeah, I was identifying as a farmer. So
perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just didn't want to skip over you if you also had a question. But I think for now, just with the time given and wanting to make sure that we give Emilie Inoue. No.
Yeah, that's good.
That
was a complete hybrid of like actual
both.
Traditional Japanese and the Western. Good job.
I've been trying to practice my pronunciation of
in your head, right?
In my head, yes. I've been going. I still didn't quite get it, but anyway, you are our next presenter, and I'd like to invite you to share your screen. And then, folks, same thing. Anytime you have questions, go ahead and put them in chat. We will hopefully have time at the end where we can sort of get questions for Emilie, but also if time allows, circle back to the other ones. And this is really just the beginning. I also want to just say that I'm also the chair of the Food Cycle Coalition and the Farm to Plate network. And some of these topics we will be revisiting in this year's body of work within the Food Cycle Coalition. So hopefully there will be plenty of time for us to continue some of these conversations. But Emilie, take it away.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. And I am Steph. Would you mind, as all of you noticed, Stephanie is very eloquent and well-versed in all these statutory authorities and stuff, a lot more than I am. So before I launch into talking about jumping worms, which is a completely different speed than where Steph was at, Stephanie, would you mind just kind of summarizing like the Vermont statutory authority around pests because I think you'd do a much better job than I would on that one.
I'll try. I didn't prepare, but
Oh,
so
I know.
the
I'm putting you
agency-
on the spot.
Yeah, that's okay. The Agency of Agriculture has regulatory authority. It's actually shared with the Forest Parks and Recs division of the Agency of Natural Resources. Thank you for shaking your head up and down, Emily. But we share authority over invasive pests in the state of Vermont, and insect pests. In particular, our concern, FPR has, or Forest Parks and Recs has the ones that impact the forests, and then we at the Agency of Agriculture have the authority to address invasives that impact agriculture specifically. And so, and we have, yeah, so that's what we do. That's the authority that we have, and we have, yeah. So I'm going to turn it over to Emily, I guess. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, you did a great job. You actually did do a lot better than I can do. Just so folks know, in most of the time, I've been doing this for 15 years. In all my years, I have primarily focused on insects and pathogens. And then this little bugger comes along, and all of a sudden, our lives become about worms. And to be completely frank, I didn't know much about worms before I realized that I had to. So I definitely went down a wormhole last night and learned a lot. So I'm hoping to share some of that today and let folks know why we're worried about this particular group of worms. So before I start, I just want to ask folks, what do you think about just generally when you think about earthworms?
And you can go ahead and put that right into chat.
Yeah, that would be great. And Natasha, can you just read some of those out?
Sure can. Healthy soil is the first one that came in. Composting in my house. Important.
Well, that could go either way, yeah.
Innocent.
Okay. All right. Well, this is perfect. Being invasive. Well, look at that.
Mhm.
Caroline is got to the crux of what this one is about. Softened soil, helping roots.
All exotic here in Vermont. Yep.
Good job, Rhonda. She's absolutely correct. So let's just launch into this. I just wanted to I guess, note that all of us have a relationship with worms, regardless of where you are in the world. And for me, I grew up thinking that worms are great. They are great soil engineers. We need them. And while it's true that a lot of them benefit us, and this is not a presentation to denigrate worms at all, there are certain species that are detrimental. And unfortunately, they are here in Vermont as well. And we just want people to be aware of them, and help us prevent the spread and slow the spread, because we are not going to eradicate them, unfortunately. So getting into the presentation here, earthworms. Like I mentioned, we all are familiar with them. Spring rain, you see them on the pavements, in our gardens. I get excited when I see them in my garden. And then, of course, fishing. A lot of us fish, and earthworms are a great bait that is sold in gas stations all over Vermont. In case you didn't know the background about worms, which I didn't, I needed to share some of this because it's just too interesting. And I think one added benefit maybe of this presentation is that you're going to go home with some cool worm trivia that might be a good dinner table conversation for some of you. Worms, they have been here for a long time, a lot longer than we have. Our fossil records indicate that they've probably been here about 600 million years. And even Aristotle in ancient Greek dubbed them the intestines of the earth. So there's a very positive association over our history. Worldwide, they've cataloged about 6,000 species. There's probably a lot more that we just don't know about. And they are not always tiny and wriggly, and in our gardens, they can be giant, which is another one that I didn't know. The longest worm ever measured was actually 22 feet, and it was found in South Africa. It's the largest species of earthworm. The common name is African giant earthworm, appropriately. And like I said, it was 22 feet. I don't know how many pounds, but it was giant. on average, this particular large species is about 4.5 feet in length. So it's like almost my length. And then it can weigh over 3 pounds easily. So we're talking about some substantive creatures here. In North America itself, we have about 150 species. So unfortunately, most of those were introduced, like Rhonda said. So earthworms, there actually are no native earthworms here in Vermont, or for that section that you can see in the left image on your slide. Most earthworms are not native to North America. And what happened was during the last glaciation period, which is about 10,000 years ago, there was a massive ice sheet or glacier that covered about a third of the continent. And when that glaciation receded, it basically left a sterile environment in a way, because there had been nothing living on it for 10,000 years. And so it killed off most of the earthworms that may have been originally there before that. And unfortunately, it wasn't just diseases and other things that the Europeans brought when they came over to North America. You can see right here, I don't know if you can see it, there's the arrows. It's called the Columbian Exchange. I didn't realize that that was what the route was called. But you can see there was a lot of cross-pollination and things going back and forth. I guess this is the early version of globalization, if you will. In this particular one, and I think it's image in a lot of textbooks, they did not include the worm. And I think it's important to recognize that, yeah, this came over with, you can see plants in there. A lot of boats were carrying plants and soil, and that's how they were introduced. The estimation is about 25 species of earthworms in North America now were introduced from Europe, and then about 14 of them are considered to be from Asia. Not as many from Africa and South America, but we have a couple, but the biggies are from Europe and Asia. So basic earthworm biology. These things are weird creatures. So yeah, you all have probably, you've all seen one. I don't know if you've held one, but they are soft, they're invertebrates, and they are composed of many segments. The worms don't have any bones, surprise, surprise, but they move by contracting and relaxing these body segments in sequence, which lets them move, it's a muscular contraction. They also have these tiny little bristle-like organs called setae, and you can see that in the bottom left corner picture, and that's what helps them to stick to slippery surfaces. Sometimes you'll see them on a wall or something, they're gripping it with these little things. And after mating, this is the really weird part, there's this reproductive gland that wraps around the worm. It looks like a little, just a colored band, and that is actually their reproductive cocoon casing. What happens is after they mate, this little band actually sloughs off. It's kind of like a tube sock. And it just, once they mate, they have the sperm and the eggs kind of collected in these segments. The band kind of sloughs off of their body. And then there's a little package there that they leave in the soil. And that's how they procreate mostly. There are up to 3 to 1,000 cocoons that can be produced by certain species. But you can see if there are a lot of them that can multiply pretty fast. So you don't need to worry about the words. I just put them in here because they're a little interesting in terms of their etymology. But where earthworms live, it's called their niche. And that is considered the position of the species within its habitat, not just worms, all of us. And a species niche includes both its physical location and the role it plays within the environment that it's in. And occupying a specific niche, earthworms, different types of earthworms are best suited for their survival, and they've kind of made their own little area where they rule the world, basically. And although there are certain characteristics that all worms share, there are certain features like their size, the pigmentation, which is their skin color, and the quickness of their movement or their muscular development. All of those things kind of combine to reflect which niche each different species is going to occupy. So there are soil-dwelling earthworms, all of these, and it falls into 3 different categories broadly. They are the compost and soil surface dwellers, topsoil dwellers, and deep burrowing subsoil dwellers. I'm going to touch on just some of these to give you just a basic overview of each of these, but I'm not going to go into too much detail on them. The epigeic, the surface dwelling earthworms, trivia, the Greek translation for epigeic is literally, it means on the earth, because these worms don't build burrows. And instead they reside among the decaying organic matter on the soil surface. And they tend to be weak burrowers. And this is the group of worms that is causing an issue for us. And I'm going to be going into more detail later about the jumping worms, but the jumping worms are classified in this category. They have relatively strong muscles, and it enables them to move faster, which is required because they do live up on top of the soil and are more vulnerable to predators. This group of worms is really important in composting, and they are known to rapidly consume material on the floor on which they occupy. So they're great for composting. They tend to reproduce really quickly and can be smaller in size than the other groups. The endogeic, the shallow burrowing earthworms, endogeic in Greek means within the earth, and it's because these worms rarely come up to the surface to feed because they prefer to spend literally their entire life within the earth. That being said, they are occupying that topsoil layer. So it's not like the deep burrowers. It's in that topsoil layer where they create kind of semi-permanent horizontal burrows. Are good for aerating gardens. They can help mix minerals and air within the soil. And, you know, they're not bad to have. These are beneficial to us a lot of times. Anisic, also beneficial. Anisic in Greek means out of the earth, because interestingly, even though these burrow really far down into the earth, far meaning like up to 6 feet, which is deep, they do come out of those burrows to feed. They have to come up to the soil level to feed. And these are the ones that grab the organic matter on the top of the soil and bring it back into the ground and start mixing things up. It can really kind of enhance and enrich and fertilize the soil that way. These are the most common types of earthworms, and we are used to them because night crawlers are in this group. And we use them for fishing bait a lot. So as we just talked about, a lot of worms are beneficial to humans. They're important for soil health. They aerate the soil, decompose plant and animal matter, enrich farmlands and gardens, and overall contribute to the biodiversity of the environment. So much so that even as a kid, and I remember reading some like kids' books about worms, we have a general collective societal understanding that worms are beneficial. And so when we switch over to talking about these, you know, bad worms, it's kind of paradoxical because we're forced to kind of hold the concept of a worm that can be beneficial, and also at the same time, another species can actually be incredibly destructive. So it's a little bit of a change of mindset here for some people. Jumping worms, that's why we're here today. This is what is causing a headache for us regulators. What do we do with earthworms that are actually causing harm to the environment? Jumping worms do. These worms have a lot of different names. They're also known as the Asian jumping worm, crazy worms, Alabama jumpers, snake worms, and I'm sure other ones that I'm not familiar with. But just so you know, a lot of these common names are probably used for other worms as well. So whenever we're actually talking about jumping worms, we want to make sure that we are drilling down to make sure that it is these three species that we know are here in Vermont and causing issues. And those are the ones you see here. This complex of worms is originally from the Far East. Japan and Korea are the most likely places they originated. And collectively, all three of them make up the jumping worm group. So when we're talking jumping worms, we could be talking about any one of these three, but their impact is the same. It's thought that they were probably introduced to North America back in the late 1800s through the horticultural trade. And some anecdotally say it started in the Southeast and only now is starting to spread up here in the Midwest and the Northeast. Regardless of how it actually happened, they're spreading and we need to do something about it. There is also the possibility that they were introduced through the sale as bait worms, but again, like with a lot of these invasive pests, we'll never know how they actually got here. So the distribution of jumping worm in the United States, you can see this, it's far. They've made it a long ways. A lot of this primarily due to human-aided movement. We are really good at helping pests hitchhike all around the world, never mind the United States. You can see some areas where California and I think, is that Oregon or Washington? Sorry, my geography is bad. One of those, but there's a huge like blank space. They're probably there too. They just haven't been picked up. In Vermont, we do know that they occur in all of the counties except in Essex and Orleans counties. Again, they're probably there. We have not found it, but that doesn't mean that they're not there. So these jumping worms do pose a serious ecological threat. They have a voracious appetite. They procreate really quickly, and they have a huge competitive edge over our, not natural, but the earthworms that we do want around. And in fact, some of the studies they've shown where jumping worms are, there are literally no other species of earthworms. Some people think that there might be a virus or something attached to these jumping worms, but that has not been corroborated, and research is ongoing. But they do colonize an area and just make sure nothing else is there. And these can have a seriously profound impact on the ecosystem. Alteration of the soil temperature and the chemistry and moisture. It reduces the forest floor organic matter and herbaceous layer, which then in turn can impact the ability for certain seed banks to grow. In particular, in Vermont, we're worried about the sugar maple, and these worms are just kind of taking out that entire organic layer that is required for seeds to start in. So definitely concerned about that. Lawns are also, where they are abundant, have been shown to look pretty crappy, honestly. So they have that aesthetic impact for homeowners. And in the garden, they can really impact any produce or vegetables or whatever you're growing, because what they do is they change the composition of the soil by pooping it out. And I'll talk to you about that in a second. These insects, not insects, my God, I'm used to it. These worms live in the topmost layer of the forest floor. So like I said, they're epigeic. They don't go into the soil too much. They may go into the top inch or so, but they primarily stay on top. And it is this leaf litter that it consumes. So the life cycle of the jumping worm, pretty simple. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. The main things that are important to note here is that these worms are annual. So adults live for just one season. They don't overwinter. these species survive in the soil as eggs and in cocoons. And honestly, you won't be seeing any of these until later in the summer. There are juveniles that come out and are in the soil earlier in the season, but they're just so small, you're not going to see them. So starting in late July, August, and into September and October, you'll see the larger adults in the soil if they're there. The peak population is again right around in August. So doing monitoring stuff during that period of time would probably be the best time to find them. And then as the weather gets cooler, these adults are not cold tolerant. So the adults will always die with the frost. Unfortunately, the eggs or the cocoons do seem to be cold tolerant, which is a real bummer. So I want to just talk about how to identify these worms. I thought the best way to it was just to show you a video of what they actually look like in action. So check it out. Let's see. So what you can see is they act kind of crazy. They jump and thrash around when they're handled or out of their natural environment, and they kind of behave more like threatened snakes. They can shed their tails also if they're grabbed in a certain way. So that's what they look like. They actually do have different behavior than a lot of the worms that we're used to here and seeing more often. The band that I was talking about is very diagnostic and is what we would be using to tell if it is a jumping worm or not from the get-go. And you can see those bands highlighted in red. I'm going to have a side-by-side with a night crawler in a second so you can see the difference. The jumping worms tend to be smooth. A lot of times they kind of have a metallic sheen. They are often darkly pigmented, like I said, because they're outside of the soil, it helps them camouflage more. They can range from anywhere between 1.5 inches to 8 inches long, so they can be pretty sizable. And that band around their body for these species is smooth and cloudy and can be white to gray, and it completely encircles the body, so it's a full band around the body. The body itself is pretty, rigid, and even though it doesn't look like it, it actually isn't as slimy as some other earthworms. All subjective. I mean, it kind of looks slimy to me, but I guess if you had a different worm, it wouldn't be as slimy, I guess. The large presence, this is another behavioral interesting thing, where there's one, there's always going to be more. So I've seen some videos where, you move the leaf litter and it's just like an explosion of jumping worms. It's gross. But you will see them kind of clustered together on the surface. So here is that example of the night worm and the jumping worms. And it's important to just know the difference here because the night crawlers aren't causing the damage that jumping worms are. So you do want to be able to pick the damaging worms and leave the beneficial ones. I say beneficial, our environment will probably be fine without the worms, but they are helping humans, work the soil more efficiently. So the bands are different here. The night crawler is like just generally more pinkish red, and that band around their body is slightly raised, whereas the jumping worm band is completely smooth and flush with the body. And again, the band is also a little bit pinkish, a lot more pinkish, and isn't white the way jumping worm is. The soil signature is an extremely identifying characteristic, and this is where the damage all occurs. The soil that comes out of jumping worms looks like coffee ground, just like a bunch of coffee grounds were thrown on the ground. They're hard, like grainy little pellets, kind of look like grape nuts, but they're essentially poop balls. Scientifically, they're called aggregates. And the University of Wisconsin-Madison actually has been studying a lot of things about jumping worms And they found that there can be high levels of iron and aluminum and potassium and calcium in these aggregates, which means that it's taking all of that outside of the plant uptake zone. The nutrients are available, but the problem is that they're all in this one poop clump, and when it rains, it washes it away and leaches out the soil. You can see a picture of the erosion issue here. You can see the cluster of the aggregates, and then on the right-hand side, the roots of some trees getting exposed because the organic layer has been completely consumed. The cocoons, I'm just mentioning this, they're so small, these are not going to be popping out at you as you walk along the garden, but it is a good indicator if you see worm eggs somehow. You can see in that middle picture, it's very tiny, but it just means that there's a worm there. You wouldn't be able to tell if it's a night crawler worm or a jumping worm egg. So just to let you know that these are what they look like in case you encounter them in the soil. What can you do? The most important thing is, I guess what you're doing is learning about it. And this is the unfortunate part of our job, is that this one doesn't have a magic bullet yet. So I'm in the position about telling you how awful this worm is and how we need to control its spread. I don't have a lot of good options for you right now in terms of treating. And I definitely recognize that, and it makes it less fun to talk about this stuff because obviously we want to provide some solutions. Right now, we're stuck with providing mechanical prevention measures and slowing the spread through, physical, I guess, disruption of the spread. If you already have them, don't panic. There are a lot of people that have them that probably don't know they have them. It's something that's here in Vermont, and we just need to figure out how to adapt to it and wait for some better control options to become available, which they will. There's a lot of research going on that I will talk about in a sec. So prevention and slowing the spread of jumping worms, that is the goal here. How can you do that? It's primarily just being aware of it, practicing good hygiene when you're traveling around. If you're in a garden or an area that has jumping worms, if you're going to a different garden or a vulnerable area, make sure that you clean all the soil and stuff off of you. A good little mantra is leave clean and arrive clean. So just constantly keeping that in your head, that all it would take is just one cocoon. The other weird thing about this particular worm is that it is able to procreate by itself. So it's parthenogenic, which means that they are able to have viable eggs by themselves. Most of the other worm species require a mate. This one, you just need one, and then it's like gremlins. They're there. There's a lot of them. So another reason, just, they're pretty aggressive in terms of wanting to colonize an area. So gardeners can keep your eyes out for that signature soil aggregate, those little worm poop. That is pretty distinctive for jumping worms. The other worm aggregates don't look the same, and they don't look as intense because jumping worm area covers the entire floor. Let's see. Also, just being worm smart when you're purchasing things. If you're out buying fishing bait or whatever, and you're buying night crawlers, you can just look and just make sure that they are night crawlers and don't look like jumping worms. And if they do, making sure that they don't get out into the environment. For anglers and fisher people, if you have extra worms at the end, don't just dump them out in the soil. That's exactly how they spread, regardless of the species. It's always good practice to throw those away and safeguard the environment from anything that you're hauling around. And so here's just a reiteration of the points, just removing all the soil and debris from your tires and shoes and clothes, depending on where you're traveling and how you're traveling. Be careful when you're going and buying plants, or, community plant sales are another area where a lot of this stuff gets exchanged. So just being aware can really help in terms of getting on your radar before it gets onto your property. Hand picking, and it sounds stupid. I mean, go hand pick an entire forest. It's not going to happen, but in your relative garden, if there are specific areas that you have them, there are ways that you can bring down the population. If you're going to get mulch and compost or soil, you can spread it out and see if there are any adults. And the one promising thing is solarization. The research has indicated that adult worms and the cocoons cannot survive above temperatures of 104 degrees, which means that making solarization packets or trying to figure out a way to increase that internal temperature to over 104 degrees, you can effectively kill off any concerns. It will probably kill off some of the other natural beneficials, but a lot of times the studies have indicated those populations tend to bounce back pretty quickly. And so depending on the material, I realize this may or may not be feasible, but I wanted to offer that because this is one way that actually it has succeeded in being effective. At least the temperature varies depending on the time of year. So if you're going to do this, make sure that you leave it at least on for 3 days during when it's really sunny, because you want to make sure that material reaches the 104 degree threshold. And studies have shown that in the sun, it takes about 3 days to reach between 104 and 105 degrees. So just keep it out for that long. Finally, the hope. People are still looking for silver bullet. Unfortunately, I don't think we're ever going to eradicate it, but certainly people are trying to figure out ways to control and manage it. Right here at UVM, I want to give a shout out to Dr. Josef Gores, who has been at the forefront of a lot of this research. So we are incredibly lucky to have somebody that knowledgeable in conducting research right here in Vermont. He is focusing a lot of his energy on trying to figure out what works the best. Beauveria bassiana is an entomopathogenic fungi that a lot of people have heard about because it's used for other pest populations to control them. But there are some promising indications that Beauveria bassiana could help with populations of jumping worms as well. They're also taking a look at a bunch of other options, some over-the-counter stuff. The data is not in, so hopefully in a couple of years, maybe even next year, we will have some recommendations that we can offer to folks instead of hand pick or wrap in plastic. But that's kind of where we're at right now. So that wraps up my presentation. There's my contact information. Feel free to get in touch with me. Also, the state entomologist works closely on this stuff too. So feel free to take our contact information down. And if we have time, I guess we can have a chat.
Thank you so much, Emilie. So a link, just so folks see it, Carolyn shared a link in the chat to some work from University of Wisconsin on protocols for jumping worms. I'll also offer up that I worked with Joseph Gores a couple of years ago and have an info sheet and some best management practices for community gardens, community composters, which a lot of it is just like, bare root plants are better, or washing them, making sure you're not bringing those egg sacs from one place to another. One thing that Carolyn also put in the chat was, it sounds like the good news is they won't be in fresh compost. I'm happy to take that, but Emilie, if you want to chime in first, certainly.
Yeah, I think, I guess define fresh. Is
Yeah.
that like fresh off the table, like the dining room table? Then yeah. But if it's been sitting around for a while and it hasn't, on the outside, it hasn't reached to full heat. Yeah, it's all in the definitions. So
Yeah, so what I know about that is that hot composting, so composting where you're reaching the 131 or hotter, so that point of killing pathogens, that does kill the egg sacs, the little cocoons. But what I understand from Joseph is that the juveniles as well as the adult worms are very adept at moving to those cooler outer edges of an active compost. And so that's part of why the solarization, even in the pictures you showed, Emilie, show like you're actually weighing down or wrapping up the material to physically constrain the worms from being able to escape to the cooler sections or out from the solarized area. And then the other thing to know in terms of compost specifically is that cure piles can be reinfected depending on where you locate it. So you also want to be aware of, if you have them, where are you putting your cure piles? Because now, once it's nice and cool and the finished compost is sitting there, those can be reinfected if they're in your area. One of the primary places that I've heard of in terms of introducing them into compost is unfortunately with leaf and yard debris. So if you go to a stump dump, or if you're collecting leaves, or if you have a landscaper who's collecting leaves from a number of different places, come and drop them off at your location, your compost location. Those are all potential vectors, so points of introducing, because the little cocoons are great at sticking to leaves and not really being noticed. And so that is one way that we've seen it just spread. And so the name of the game, as Emilie said, really is, if you know you have them, really try not to share the love. And if you don't have them, there are some precautions and things to think about in terms of really trying to not introduce them to your site.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, from a, I get, and you know more about this than I do, Natasha, but like you're when you're actively composting and you're a business, you need your bulking carbon agents, and one of those is leaves. So you need to be careful for that reason. So like that's part of the recipe. Yeah, and then maybe doing activities on concrete, where you're not having contact with the earth in your composting activities. It increases the cost of operation, but there's a way, you could effectively potentially solarize on a hard surface, a concrete surface, or wrapping in plastic. So yeah, lots of things to think about when you're engaging in this activity.
Yeah, and Shannon says, or rather they wouldn't be in active piles. Again, they have been found in the edges of active piles and windrows. So a little bit less in vessel in terms of, like if it's contained and it's really, it's much more homogeneous and being mixed and at a more of the material is at those higher temperatures at the same time. But unfortunately, piles, bins, windrows, if they're in there, there's usually a cooler place that the worms can hang out. And even if you fold them into the middle where it's nice and hot, they just spread. So yeah, an unfortunate truth, I guess, to that piece. Yeah, so it's definitely something to be on the lookout for, I guess.
Yeah, and I didn't mention this. There is another worm associated with the jumpers. It's called the hammerhead worm. And I just decided not to get too complicated, but this one is another invasive that we're keeping an eye out, and they literally look kind of like a hammerhead, like as their name implies. So yeah, we're definitely kind of looking for those as well and concerned about that.
And are those also they're problematic? I mean, invasive doesn't necessarily mean problematic, as we established all of them are problematic, but
It's a little unclear to me. Stephanie, you might know more about this part.
Yeah, my recollection is that they're actually they're poisonous.
Oh.
So they could, I mean, not that we're going to be eating them, but I think they have a toxin associated with them. But that's all I got, which isn't a lot.
Interesting. All right. Tomorrow we are continuing the program at 10 a.m. We're going to be hearing about partnerships in composting technology, sort of a two-part session, similar to this one in terms of two different topics. The first is about depackaging technology. And then the second one is about partnering farm anaerobic digestion with compost producers. And then at 1 p.m. is the compost soil science and hydrology activities for K through 12 schools. We've got two fabulously dynamic educators who will be joining us for that session. And so with that, we are just about at the half hour here. And so Stephanie and Emilie, thank you so much for sharing all of your expertise.